It was a cold, foggy evening when Jonathan received the letter. The thick, yellowed paper bore no return address, and the wax seal was an intricate design of a raven clutching a key. He hesitated before opening it, an inexplicable sense of dread creeping up his spine. But curiosity won over, and he carefully broke the seal. The letter was written in elegant, flowing script. "Dear Mr. Jonathan Blake, you are cordially invited to the reading of the last will and testament of your great-uncle Edward Holloway at Hollow Hill Manor. As his only living relative, it is imperative that you attend. The reading will take place at midnight on the first full moon of the month. Sincerely, Malcolm Graves, Attorney at Law." Jonathan frowned. He had never heard of an Edward Holloway, nor had he ever known of any family estate called Hollow Hill Manor. The name sounded ominous, and the thought of venturing to an unknown location at midnight was unsettling. Yet something in the letter called to him, a pull he couldn't quite explain. 2 days later, Jonathan found himself on a lonely train, headed towards the outskirts of the city. The landscape grew more desolate as the train chugged along, thick forests of skeletal trees and mist-covered fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The other passengers on the train seemed equally distant, their eyes glazed over as they stared out of the windows. By the time the train reached the small, dilapidated station, it was nearly dark. Jonathan stepped off, his breath visible in the crisp night air. A black, horse-drawn carriage waited for him at the edge of the platform. The driver, a tall man in a black cloak, gave no greeting, merely gesturing for Jonathan to enter. The ride to Hollow Hill Manor was long and silent. The trees pressed in on either side of the narrow, winding road, their branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. The only sound was the steady clop of the horse's hooves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Jonathan felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, a suffocating presence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. Finally, the carriage came to a halt in front of a massive, looming structure. Hollow Hill Manor was a Gothic monstrosity, its jagged spires and gabled roofs silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The windows were dark, and the air around the house was eerily still. The driver opened the door, and Jonathan stepped out, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestone path. As he approached the grand entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit foyer. The air inside was musty, thick with the scent of old wood and decaying fabric. A single flickering candle on a nearby table cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. Jonathan's eyes were drawn to a large, ornate portrait hanging above the grand staircase. The man in the painting had the same sharp features and piercing blue eyes as Jonathan, a distant relative perhaps. "Mr. Blake," a voice rasped from the shadows. Jonathan turned to see an elderly man emerging from a side room. He was dressed in a faded black suit, his thin frame hunched with age. His eyes were sunken, and his skin had the pallor of someone who had not seen the sun in years. "I am Malcolm Graves," the man continued. "Please, follow me. The others are waiting." Jonathan followed the old man through a series of narrow, twisting hallways, the floorboards creaking underfoot. They finally reached a heavy wooden door at the end of a long corridor. Graves pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with shadows. A large, round table sat in the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs. 5 other figures were already seated, their faces hidden in the gloom. "Please, take a seat," Graves instructed. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before sitting in the only empty chair. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and a chill ran down his spine. "Let us begin," Graves said, his voice echoing through the room as he produced a weathered, leather-bound book. The room seemed to grow darker as he opened it, the flickering candlelight barely piercing the gloom. Jonathan felt a strange sensation, as if the very walls of the manor were closing in around him. The others at the table remained silent, their faces obscured by the shadows. As Graves began to read the will, the room grew colder, and Jonathan's unease turned to outright fear. but it was too late to turn back now. As Graves read the words from the ancient book, Jonathan could feel an invisible tension building in the room. The walls seemed to breathe, the flickering candlelight casting grotesque shapes on the dark paneled wood. The voice of the old man droned on, describing the vast estate, its hidden fortunes, and the peculiar conditions attached to the inheritance. "And to my dear nephew, Jonathan Blake, I bequeath the entirety of Hollow Hill Manor, with all its possessions and secrets. However, the estate comes with a solemn warning. The legacy of Hollow Hill is not one of wealth alone, but of responsibility. He who inherits the manor must stay within its walls for a full cycle of the moon, from one full moon to the next, to claim his inheritance. Any attempt to leave before this period is completed will result in forfeiture of all claims, and the curse shall be passed on to the next of kin." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. A curse. The word hung in the air, a tangible threat that sent shivers down his spine. He glanced around the table, but the other guests remained silent, their faces hidden in the shadowy recesses of their hoods. Before he could ask any questions, Graves closed the book with a heavy thud. The sound reverberated through the room, causing the candle flames to flicker and dance wildly. "Your uncle's final wish, Mr. Blake, is that you honor this tradition. The manor is now yours, but so are its burdens. Do you accept?" Jonathan hesitated. The entire situation felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. But curiosity, and perhaps a touch of greed, urged him forward. "I accept," he said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at his insides. The old man nodded, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Very well. The servants will show you to your quarters. Remember, you must not leave this house until the full cycle is complete." As Jonathan stood to leave, the other figures around the table rose in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. They exited the room without a word, disappearing into the shadows of the manor like phantoms. A young maid appeared at the doorway, her eyes downcast as she led Jonathan through the labyrinthine corridors to his room. The manor was a maze of darkened hallways and winding staircases, the heavy silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Finally, they reached a large wooden door at the end of a narrow hallway. The maid pushed it open to reveal a grand bedroom, furnished with antique pieces that seemed to have been untouched for centuries. A large four-poster bed dominated the room, its velvet curtains drawn back to reveal freshly laundered sheets. A roaring fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm orange glow across the room. The maid set down a candle on the bedside table and turned to leave. Before she exited, she paused, glancing back at Jonathan with a look of apprehension. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "be careful of the night. The manor, it has a way of playing tricks on the mind." Jonathan wanted to ask her what she meant, but she had already slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. He was alone. He walked over to the bed and sat down, the mattress sinking slightly under his weight. The fire's warmth was comforting, but the maid's warning lingered in his mind. What did she mean by tricks on the mind? As the hours passed, Jonathan found himself unable to sleep. The silence of the manor was oppressive, every creak and groan of the old house amplified in the stillness. He lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of curses, legacies, and the strange people he had met earlier. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from somewhere in the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Jonathan sat up, his heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the hallways. He grabbed the candle from the bedside table and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down his spine. He followed the sounds, the light from the candle casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps led him to a door at the end of the corridor, one he hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. Jonathan hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, but something compelled him to push the door open. The room beyond was a small study filled with shelves of dusty books and old, tattered furniture. In the center of the room stood a large, ancient desk, and on it lay an open book, its pages yellowed with age. The candlelight flickered over the words, revealing a language Jonathan couldn't decipher. As he approached the desk, the whispers grew louder, forming words that echoed in his mind. "Leave now, or face the consequences." Jonathan felt a sudden wave of fear wash over him, but before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The room grew colder, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing as if alive. He turned to the door, desperately trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into frenzied, unintelligible muttering, the air around him thick with a malevolent presence. Then the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jonathan stood frozen in the pitch-black room, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled in the darkness, searching for the door handle, but it remained stubbornly locked. The cold seemed to seep into his very bones, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the room, followed by another. The sound was coming from the walls, from every direction, surrounding him. Jonathan pressed his back against the desk, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? The knocking continued, rhythmic and relentless, as if something was trying to get in or out. Jonathan tried to steady his breathing, forcing himself to think clearly. He needed to find a way out of this room, away from whatever malevolent force was haunting him. In the darkness, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the desk. A key. He grabbed it, his fingers trembling, and turned back to the door. To his relief, the key fit perfectly into the lock. With a quick turn, the door swung open, and Jonathan stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The hallway was eerily quiet, the oppressive silence only broken by the sound of his own breathing. The shadows on the walls seemed to have stilled, and the temperature had returned to normal. But the fear lingered, gnawing at him. Jonathan knew he had to leave the manor, but the terms of the will echoed in his mind. He must stay for a full cycle of the moon to claim his inheritance. Was it worth risking his life for a fortune? Before he could make a decision, a soft voice called out to him from the darkness. "Jonathan, come this way." He turned to see a figure standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in the pale light of the moon streaming through a nearby window. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading down her back. Her face was obscured, but her presence was strangely calming. "Who are you?" Jonathan asked, his voice shaky. "I am Eliza," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am here to help you. Follow me, and I will show you the truth." Despite his fear, Jonathan felt compelled to follow her. She led him through the winding corridors of the manor, her footsteps silent on the cold stone floor. The manor seemed to stretch on endlessly, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Finally, they reached a door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. Eliza paused, her hand resting on the door handle. "Behind this door lies the truth of Hollow Hill Manor," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But be warned, Jonathan, once you see it, there is no turning back." Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He nodded, and Eliza pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike any other in the manor. It was a grand, opulent chamber, filled with gold and jewels that glittered in the candlelight. But the centerpiece of the room was a large, ornate mirror that dominated the far wall. Its surface was polished to a perfect shine, reflecting the room in flawless detail. Eliza stepped aside, allowing Jonathan to approach the mirror. As he drew closer, he felt a strange sensation, as if the mirror was drawing him in. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something off. His reflection's eyes were filled with a deep, dark sorrow. Then, without warning, the reflection began to move on its own, its mouth twisting into a cruel smile. Jonathan stumbled back, but the reflection remained in place, its eyes locking onto his. "You are not the first to be lured here by the promise of wealth," the reflection said, its voice a distorted echo of Jonathan's own. "Hollow Hill Manor feeds on the souls of the greedy and the foolish. And now, it has you." Jonathan tried to look away, but he was transfixed by the reflection's gaze. The room around him seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in as the mirror's surface rippled like water. Eliza's voice broke through the madness. "Jonathan, you must break free. The mirror is the source of the manor's power. Destroy it, and you may yet escape." Summoning every ounce of strength, Jonathan tore his gaze away from the mirror and grabbed a nearby candlestick. With a cry of desperation, he hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a different fragment of the room. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the ground beneath him began to tremble, and the walls of the manor groaned as if in pain. The shadows on the walls writhed and twisted, converging on the broken mirror, which pulsed with a dark energy. Jonathan ran from the room, the sound of the manor collapsing around him. He could hear Eliza's voice urging him on, guiding him through the labyrinthine halls. The doorways and corridors twisted in unnatural ways, the manor's very structure warping as the malevolent force within it was unleashed. Finally, he burst through the front doors and into the cold night air. Behind him, Hollow Hill Manor crumbled into dust, the dark energy consuming it from within. The ground shook violently as the manor was swallowed by the earth, leaving nothing but an empty void where it once stood. Jonathan collapsed onto the cold, dew-covered grass, gasping for breath. The night was silent once more, the oppressive presence of the manor gone. He glanced back at the empty space where the manor had stood, unable to comprehend what had just happened. As he lay there, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm light over the landscape. The full moon had set, and with it, the curse of Hollow Hill Manor had been lifted. But the memory of the horrors he had witnessed would stay with Jonathan forever. Jonathan didn't know how long he lay there, staring at the empty space where Hollow Hill Manor had once loomed. The rising sun slowly banished the lingering darkness, but the cold fear in his chest refused to dissipate. His mind replayed the events of the night, trying to make sense of the supernatural forces that had nearly claimed his life. Eventually, the sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a group of villagers cautiously making their way up the hill, their faces etched with concern. They must have heard the commotion and come to investigate. "Are you all right, sir?" one of the men asked, his voice tinged with disbelief as he took in the scene. Jonathan nodded weakly, pushing himself up onto shaky legs. "The manor? It's gone," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "It collapsed. It's over." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared question him. They could see the haunted look in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. Whatever had happened on Hollow Hill, it was clear that Jonathan had survived something unimaginable. They led him back to the village, where he was given a warm meal and a place to rest. The villagers were kind, but Jonathan could see the suspicion in their eyes. They had heard the stories of Hollow Hill Manor, whispers of a cursed place, where those who entered never returned. And now, here was a man claiming to have survived its destruction. As the days passed, Jonathan began to recover physically, but the memories of that night refused to fade. He spent hours staring out the window of the small cottage where he was staying, lost in thought. The villagers kept their distance, wary of the man who had returned from the dead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan felt a familiar presence in the room. He turned to see Eliza standing in the doorway, her ethereal form glowing softly in the twilight. "You did well, Jonathan," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "The curse of Hollow Hill is broken, and the souls trapped within are free." Jonathan felt a pang of sorrow as he looked at her. "What about you, Eliza? Are you free as well?" She smiled, a bittersweet expression. "Yes, but my time in this world is over. I was bound to the manor, and now that it is gone, so too must I go." Jonathan wanted to say something, to ask her to stay, but the words caught in his throat. Eliza stepped forward, reaching out to touch his hand, though he felt nothing but a cool breeze. "Remember, Jonathan," she whispered, "you have a new life ahead of you. Do not let the shadows of the past define you. Live well and find the peace that I could not." With those final words, Eliza's form began to fade, her image dissolving into the evening light. Jonathan watched as she disappeared, leaving him alone once more. But this time, the solitude was not so heavy. The weight of the curse was gone, and with it, the dark legacy of Hollow Hill Manor. Jonathan eventually left the village, determined to start anew. The inheritance that had once seemed so important no longer mattered to him. Instead, he sought out a quiet life, far from the horrors he had witnessed. But every now and then, in the stillness of the night, he would think of Eliza and the souls that had been freed. And he would remember the lesson he had learned in the darkness of that cursed manor. Some treasures are not worth the price they demand. The end.